Well, good afternoon. Hello. Thank you all for joining this time. My name is Mitch Stutzman, and I serve as the Director of Development and Partner Engagement at Menno Media. Pleased to be joined here by Lana Miller, one of our friends from Everence Financial. She's a stewardship consultant that offices in Harrisonburg, Virginia. I'll let her say any other words of introduction in a moment as well. Grateful for these Provident giving sessions that we've done. This is our third and final in our series where we'll be talking about strategic generosity at year end. I'm grateful that Lana has joined us for these times to bring in some of her expertise from her experience and the experience of her colleagues at Everence that support people in the area of charitable giving and providing us meaningful prompts to think about these things. So at this point, Lana, I will turn it over to you.
Great. It's good to be here again and to see some familiar names that are joining me. So we're talking about strategic generosity at year end, and I'm sure some of you are going to have questions. So I look forward to what those will be. So feel free to interrupt me even throughout if you would like. As we begin today, I would just invite you for a moment to reflect on a particular person, maybe even a particular experience or situation when you experience someone else's generosity. Perhaps it was generosity towards you, maybe it was generosity towards someone else or even an organization, but sometime when you experienced someone's generosity. And as you think about that story, I would just invite you to think about what you learned about generosity from that person, from that experience. And I don't know if anybody wants to share, or maybe as you're thinking about sharing, I can share my story. But I'm curious what stories came to mind, what learnings you had about generosity from that particular person, from that particular experience. Let me share my story. One story that I think about is at my grandfather's funeral. The pastor, or one of the pastors that from the church, came to me in the hallway. And this was a pastor when he had been younger. So it was an older pastor. And he said, "I'll always remember this about your grandfather." One day, my grandfather actually worked with heavy equipment. And so he was out by himself in northern Indiana one afternoon. And he said, he came to the church and he said he was working and he just felt God's invitation to come and give the pastor some money because somebody needed it. And the pastor said he was struck because he pulled out $100 bill. And I don't remember that my grandpa was like incredibly wealthy, that $100, he would have had multiple $100 bills. So interesting, he had this $100 bill in his wallet. He pulled out a $100 bill, gave it to the pastor, and then he left. And the pastor said, for a moment, I thought, what am I going to do with this money? But it wasn't long. About 15 to 20 minutes later, a woman pulled into the church, her car filled with all of her life belongings, her 3 children. She came in and to the pastor, she was crying and she said, "I have no money for gas and I have no money to feed my children." The pastor said, "I knew where the money was supposed to go. I gave the money to her." And that was the end of the story. But he said, "I have never forgotten that experience with your grandfather." I was thankful he shared that with me because I thought, wow, this is profound. So when I think about what I learned from this story, I think about generosity coming out of a relationship with God. I think about the fact that he was in prayer. He was thinking about how he could participate with God in what God was doing. He listened. He was invited and he listened and he went and he did. And he gave without strings attached. He didn't know who was getting it, how it was going to be utilized, what it was going to be used for. And so that has made a profound impact on me as I think about generosity. Anybody else? I'm curious. If not, I'm sure you all have stories that have come to mind.
While
Mitch?
others are thinking, I might add a profound experience for me. When I was just out of college, a buddy of mine and I and his parents decided we were going to go on this like cross country motorcycle trip. And we enjoyed riding motorcycles. It was great. We started in northern Indiana, where I had lived at the time, and we were traveling down the Blue Ridge Parkway, south of where Lana lives now, in Virginia. And through a very unfortunate series of events, I crashed my motorcycle on that trip. My motorcycle went sliding down the road and hit my buddy on his motorcycle, knocked him out. And so it could have been way, way worse. We walked away from that experience with, you know, anyway, we walked away from that, but it meant that our modes of transportation that we were four people traveling on three motorcycles, and suddenly we were four people with one motorcycle between all of us with no other mode of transportation. My buddy and I were transported to the hospital in an ambulance to get attention there. And his folks started going about trying to figure out what are we going to do to get where we need to go. We're about an hour away from where we were staying on our trip. And they went to the pharmacy there in this town in Southern Virginia. And my friend's mother said she was there picking up medications for us since we were prescribed medications after our hospital visit. And she said she whispered a little prayer saying, I don't know what we're going to do. Please help. And an element of the story that's helpful to know is that this family had their roots in the German Baptist Church. And if you're familiar with the German Baptist tradition, they have a particular dress that sets them apart. And she tells the story that after she whispered this little prayer in the aisle of the Rite Aid pharmacy in Southern Virginia, that a German Baptist couple walked in the door of the pharmacy. And she's like, well, this is as close to an answer to prayer as I can experience. So she walked up to them and she said, this is going to seem very strange, but we're in a tight spot. And would you be willing to help? And this couple put their lives on hold to transport my buddy and I an hour out of the way, drop us off. They had to drive an hour back home then. And when we were thanking them for their generous expression of hospitality and care for us, these strangers that they were just going about their day in a Rite Aid pharmacy, when they were asked to suspend the rest of their plans and engage in this activity. And when we tried to offer them cash for gas for this experience or for inconveniencing them, they refused and said it was part of answering a call that they have committed to, and that our responsibility was just to answer calls when we receive them. And so that has stuck with me as this moment of just like, we horribly inconvenienced this couple, but they were willing to answer the call and be really helpful for us in a time where we needed it.
Thanks, Mitch. Well, we all have stories of generosity, and perhaps how we've experienced them or how we've also seen others experience generosity. And I think that those things shape us tremendously. I also think about it always in this season. We are entering the season of Thanksgiving. When I think about what it means to be grateful and gratitude, we know that those who are the most grateful are gratitude has a direct impact on generosity. When we are attentive to the things we have to be grateful for, we become more generous to others as well. We also have this holiday of Christmas, of celebrating an incredibly generous God who offers us his son. So, what does that look like as we think about our response, our participation in with what God is doing around us and with us? As I was also thinking about this, these passages in Acts to keep these, they're pretty profound, I think, for me in looking at this early church who is experiencing in many ways the Spirit of God coming in incredible kinds of ways and moving people. In Acts 2, verse 42, it says, all the believers devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching, to fellowship and sharing in meals, including the Lord's Supper and prayer. A deep sense of awe came over them. The apostles performed many miraculous signs and wonders, and all the believers met together in one place and shared everything they had. They sold their property and possessions and shared money with those in need. And each day the Lord added to their fellowship those who were being saved. It goes on in chapter 3 to talk about some of these miraculous signs and wonders. In chapter 4, it talks about everything they owned not being their own, sharing all that they had. But I think this story, perhaps like some of the other stories we might tell, impacts us as we think about how these people in Acts were impacted so and overwhelmed by God's spirit of generosity that they could hardly hold back. They sold all that they had, wanting to live with one another in community. And as we also know in the Acts story, there were some who didn't do or want to live in the same kind of community. So there were resistance to some of that as well. But I think it's an interesting thing to consider and to think about at this time of year. So let me just go back to, I'm going to share my screen here, to one of the first sessions that we were together. We talked about this definition of stewardship when we were talking about why we give. We looked at this definition that stewardship is the active and responsible management of God's creation for God's purpose. I think that this is an interesting definition of stewardship as we think about end of year giving. As we think about this topic for today, how can we be strategic in our generosity? That it's active and responsible management of God's creation for God's purpose, especially when we feel like there are so many needs around us. How are we going to give? Where are we going to give? Who are we going to give? What are we going to give? Not out of obligation or expectation or because we get some kind of charitable deduction on our tax returns, but simply out of God's response or out of our relationship with God and our relationship with others. This invitation to participate in stewardship and in generosity and giving. Yesterday, as I was in conversation, I'll stop sharing to say this little story. I talked with Glenn Kaufman, who's one of the financial consultants. He's one of the senior financial consultants, probably at Everence as a whole, but he works specifically out of the Harrisonburg office. And before he was a financial consultant, worked with the charitable foundation, with Everence Foundation. So I asked him, Glenn, you've worked with so many people. You look at investments, you look at retirement planning, you look at all of these kinds of things. Why do people give? Why are people interested in giving? And this is what he said. People give to support the organizations they love, who also reinforce their values. People give to support the organizations they love, who also reinforce their values. And then he went on to say something that I thought was really, really fascinating as I was, because I knew what I had prepared to share today. He said, I also find it interesting, he said, that I have a lot of clients, especially at year end, um, who think that fundraisers are simply calling them because they think they have a lot of money. But he said, I try to tell people that fundraisers aren't necessarily, he said, at least good fundraisers, aren't calling you because they think that you have a lot of money. In fact, what we know is we aren't going to give to organizations that we don't know or have relationship with, or share values with. So if we don't have anything in common, it's pretty much a blank phone call for a fundraiser if they're trying to call us. But what fundraisers are trying to do, which actually is fairly similar to what we're trying to do as people who are giving, is they're trying to identify who are the people who care deeply about the mission of their organization and provide them an opportunity to participate with that. They're trying to build relationships that are going to last. They're not trying to find somebody who's just going to give money once and then never give it again. Organizations are trying to find people whose values align with their work. So, as we think about this year-end giving, I'm going to invite you to consider this question. When there's so much need in our world, how do you decide who you're going to give to? And perhaps how you can make the most impact. Especially at the end of the year, many of us are bombarded with letters, postcards, and more letters, phone calls, maybe even visits from development people, all representing organizations that we've loved and maybe some extras that we haven't even known about and who think that they might gain something from us. And it can become overwhelming when we start to see the amount of need that exists. So at year end, I'm wondering, what would it be like this year when you receive a letter in the mail that's asking for money, to not see it as simply another request, but as an invitation to prayer? What if this year you used these times as a way to think about and to discern how you might participate specifically and make impact in one or two or three things that you care deeply about? What if this season became an opportunity to get to know the organizations that you've loved for so long and to learn more about the work that they're doing? Perhaps in the season of busyness, because I know from Thanksgiving to Christmas, it becomes a series of unfolding chaos, I could say, maybe. What if it was a space to pause? What if these kinds of invitations were simply a space, gave us space to be in the quiet and prayerfully consider how we're being invited to participate in what God's doing? We can't do everything. We can't participate in everything. And I think sometimes the numbness of the season, when everything feels like, oh, what can I do? And I don't know who all I should support or where I can go, it can become a space of overwhelm. But what if we could turn this around to a space of reflection? And perhaps more than now, within our world and all that's going on, like the people in Acts, it's a time to be overcome by God's abundance and to consider how we might participate with one another. I was talking about this idea. What if it was an opportunity to have conversations with the organizations that we love? And so this is an idea of something we could do at year end. When these letters come or the phone calls come, what if we actually took it seriously to learn more about these organizations? I know, I mean, at least statistically, and in the organizations that I work with, that since the pandemic, organizations have been shifting and changing to meet needs in very different kinds of ways. So it could be a very interesting question for you to ask an organization, what has been most challenging for you over the last couple years? And what are the emerging or exciting things that have come out of those spaces of challenge? So, not to put Mitch on the spot, but Mitch, since you're here with Menno Media, if I were calling you or you were calling me on the phone to talk with me about Menno Media, and I said, hey, Mitch, instead of giving me your normal spiel, could you just tell me, over the last couple years, there's a lot of things that have happened. In those things that have happened, what are some of those challenges and what are the ways that Menno Media is working to shift and change or meet those kinds of emerging needs? Like what's arising, what's coming up for you? I'm assuming you're ready. You can do this because this is what you really wish that somebody like me would be asking.
Right, you're right, Lana. When donors ask that question, it's a real gift to the organization because it gives us an opportunity to deepen that relationship and to bring people into the work in a more meaningful way, I think. And all of you are here responding to a prompt that was sent out through Menno Media, and so you're all friends of Menno Media at some level. And what Lana's laying out, and I'll just give you a glimpse as to what has happened for us. 2020 surprised everybody in the nonprofit sector and in the public sector everywhere. Um, in the world of publishing, a huge portion of what we do is publish books. And that saw a huge increase in 2020, that people were at home, they had extra time, and they bought books. At the same time, a huge portion of what we do at Menno Media is develop curriculum and resources to support congregations. And many congregations stopped meeting in the way that they had previously in 2020 during the thick of the pandemic. And so we saw this very interesting shift in how our resources and what we were producing was being consumed by our constituents. And now, as time has gone by, sort of the big bump in sales that we saw in books has sort of dropped, and it's dropped across the industry that we work in. And the curriculum sales didn't rebound in the same way because churches used the opportunity that was presented to them to sort of reimagine what they're doing and to lean into something different and experiment with new things. And so Menno Media was presented with this opportunity to look at what we were offering and say, how are we going to meet the needs of a changing constituency, of a changing church? And that has led to some really cool innovation, I think, in the way that we're holding curriculum and the way that we're putting energy into developing a new way to do faith formation. Those are the things that really get me excited that would not have been a part of our conversation 3+ years ago, just because of the changing landscape that we find ourselves in. And so Menno Media is just like all of the other organizations that are out there that are looking at how can what our core competency is be a service to the world, and how can we continue to serve in that way, and how do we engage folks in that mission and pull people alongside us to accomplish that work. So that would be part of what I would reflect. Does that answer your question, Lotta?
Yeah, and if I were talking with you longer, I would push out a few more of those kinds of things because I would want to know a little bit more about. So, what does that mean about Sunday school curriculum? And what does that mean about a decrease in sales of books? And how does that look? Yeah, I think it adds, these kinds of questions can just add to understanding a little bit more. And when we understand a little bit more, we have clarity. I mean, some of these things can help bring clarity, like to why I give to Menno Media or why I would want to participate in the kind of work that you are doing. The other thing, so on this slide, it says talk to professionals. So I would say talk to the development and fundraising professionals in these organizations, ask them some of these kinds of questions, gain some information and understanding, and also talk to your tax professionals, your financial consultants, people who know you. So your particulars, over this last year, understand the economic market and the impact that it's had in your finances. There's also a lot of individual kinds of things that happen in our lives, different transitions that we experience. So maybe there's a particular death or marriage status changes, a birth of a child, or other kinds of, retirement, inheritance from the death of a loved one. Something like those kinds of things are all incredible things to be able to bring to a financial consultant to assist you, because they may actually think or have some ideas for you and give you some input that you never would have thought about on your own, and can impact then a gift at year end. I would add a caveat, and again, I'm not trying to be a shameless promoter here of Everence, but I would add a caveat because the conversations I have often in congregations when we talk about charitable tools, and people say to me, why didn't my financial consultant assist me? If they knew that I was giving this to a charitable cause, why then did they not help me bypass some of the taxes that I incurred? This is often a very difficult question for me to answer, but the way that I answer or try to answer is to say that not every financial consultant understands your charitable intent. Not every financial consultant would share your values in charitable giving, and not every financial consultant even has the tools or the education to know how to advise you in charitable giving ways. So to find someone who you can trust with your finances, who also has some of these things connected to the charitable giving part, is an important piece of the puzzle as well. I would just say these kinds of conversations can really help us clarify our values, what's most important to us, especially when there's so many kinds of options. How much we have to give, it helps give us focus, so that we can also leave a greater impact, that we can maximize our gifts as well. So that's one piece here. Let me share my screen again and go back to some of these tools. Some things that we could use, some more practical things that we can use as we think about year-end giving. And maybe the next thing isn't as much a practical tool as it is just something that I think everybody can reflect on. And that is one of the basic things we start with as we're talking with anybody about money is a cash flow plan. So what money is coming in, what money is going out, where is it going? How is what you're doing with your money reflecting your faith and values, or how is it not? How could it be adjusted? So for everyone to have kind of a check on what's happening with their money can be a useful thing at year end, because as you're considering what your money is being used for and how it's being used, it might be a really good time to say, hey, I dedicated this amount of money 10 years ago to be giving every year, but I've never looked at it again. I kind of said it and then I forgot about it. But, I've had an increase in salary, or I had an increase in some other kinds of areas, and I have more money here that I would have available to gift. It's a helpful thing to know. Or perhaps you're spending less money in particular areas and you would say, oh, here's some extra money because I'm not spending as much that might be available to gift in another kind of way. So looking through your cash flow plan, looking through your spending, your giving, your saving, can often assist you in thinking about what you might have, or help you to decide what you have available. And that's a great place to actually begin this conversation.
Lana, can
Yeah.
I jump
Yeah,
in
you
just for a
yeah,
moment?
jump in.
Um,
Jump in.
Before we get too far away from the slide talking about talking to the professionals in your life, Lana did bring up the services that are available through Everence. Everence can serve folks anywhere across the United States, regardless of where you are. Great team of advisors that really put values of the client first and really understand this whole charitable talk. Menno Media serves across the United States and Canada. If you are Canadian and you're looking for advisory services similar to what you would experience from an Everence, our friends at Abundance Canada would be a great starting point in that conversation then as well. So I wanted to throw in that piece before we get too far away from it.
Now I'll just talk about a couple ideas, some other things that you might consider or think about at year end. So this is an easy one. So while we're talking about saving and spending and giving, one resource that you might find valuable is a My Neighbor card. Everence has a My Neighbor card. There are other kinds of cards that may have some similar things with some other credit unions or banks, but our My Neighbor card is specifically designed so that 1.5% of whatever you spend can be designated towards a charity of your choice. And so then we at Everence actually write a check to the charities that people designate and give them actual dollars for that. So this is kind of one of those easy ways. And we have business cards, we have individual cards, but it's an easy way that you can be giving money that you've already spent anyway, but it could be in addition to perhaps other kinds of giving. Some of the tools we talked about the last time I'll go into a little bit, not talking particularly about what the tool is, but maybe how it could be utilized, especially at year end. So this is the donor advised fund. If you remember, or if you haven't seen it in the last section, it's basically a, oops, there we go. It's basically a charitable bank account or checking account that you can write checks out of. One of the thing, and you can put money into it from a variety of sources, especially appreciated assets and other kinds of things can go into this kind of donor advised fund, or can be used to balance out giving, maybe in high earning years with lower earning years, things like that. That's what I'll say about that. The one thing I wanted to note with a donor advised fund is that what we've realized is that there are many Americans who already have donor advised funds that have grown to very large balances over the last decade. So they haven't been perhaps giving as much out of them as they perhaps had put into them. And so these balances continue to, the money is invested, continues to gain in money. And I think one of the things, if you have one of these accounts to look at, is consider how much you might want to give, or perhaps give more than you might have given before out of these kinds of accounts. So with the variety of need that comes, the opportunity to give, or considering to give more out of these funds, is a possibility. A particular kind of donor advised fund is a family donor advised fund, or it can be set up as a family donor advised fund. And this, I work with a few of these, and they're particularly fun. They have some interesting kinds of ways that you can work at this. So multiple people can give to the fund, or maybe just one person can give to the fund. And then there's various ways of also disseminating from this fund. And as I was sharing this earlier with Mitch, you said that you had a story of a family who looked at a donor advised fund together.
Yeah, I am aware of a family that the grandparents in this structure have a donor advised fund, and at Thanksgiving every year they gather their family together, and they have encouraged each of their grandchildren who are below the age of 10 still, and there's a handful of grandchildren. that encourage their grandchildren to come and do a presentation to the family on a charity that they are passionate about. And then grandma and grandpa make a distribution out of their donor advised fund in support of these charities that their grandchildren have brought to their attention. So it's a way for grandma and grandpa to engage in philanthropy and to serve their particular philanthropic goals, but then a way to encourage this sort of generational generosity that I think is a really cool little outlook. And now the family always looks forward to these times of presentations around the Thanksgiving table, so grandma and grandpa can make charitable distributions at the end of the year. I thought that was
And
cool.
and it's another way perhaps to learn about organizations that you wouldn't have known about. I sometimes find that can be helpful. Um, and that could be a way too that you learn about the interests and the values of your children and grandchildren. Um, so it's an interesting way of gathering some information in a variety of sorts. Another idea is how you could set up in some ways like a matching grant system. So if they would make that kind of presentation, or if your children or grandchildren would say, I'm going to be giving this amount of money to this organization, it would be another then thing to say, well, I'm willing to match um, a certain amount of money that you give to the organization you give to. So encouraging them to give as well as then you're giving in addition um, is another idea of what people have done. And I think, especially like you name, around the time of Thanksgiving and Christmas, we have some opportunities at year end to think about some of these creative ways of giving. There's a lot of other things that families have done, but I think just to draw out these two things can be sometimes helpful. One thing that I would also add with donor advised funds, as I named, you can gift, as we talked about the last time, um, gifts of real estate, and that or other appreciated assets can be utilized through a donor advised fund. One of the hesitations I would have is that at year end that you tried to make the sale of a property happen before the end of the year, especially if you're starting even about now. Sometimes that can take a longer time. So if you're thinking about appreciated assets or things that will need to be sold in order to gift, this could be a good time to consider future gifts and transitioning some larger assets in future or coming years. But perhaps year end isn't always the best time to try to rush to make those kinds of gifts happen, especially if it's in a month or two period of time. So I would just note that that's something to pay attention to. A couple other
There's a lot that does go into the gift of real estate, and our friends at Everence and at Abundance Canada are both experts in navigating all of that. So if that is ever something that is of interest in you talking about, before you make any moves on your own, I would get in touch, because there are some nuances to that that can get a little tricky sometimes. So I just wanted to put in my encouragement to visit with the professionals in your life if that's even something that you're toying with, not necessarily before the end of the year, but even next year or 5 years from now, to start thinking about how that might look.
So these have been some ideas of some immediate impact kind of things, or how you could utilize some of these tools for immediate impact. The last one here that makes an immediate impact, and then I'll talk about some things that make impact a little later, is this idea of using, and we talked about this the last time as well, this required minimum distribution. At 73, when you have a required minimum distribution from an IRA, you would be able then to make that roll it directly over to the charity of your choice in a tax, not then assuming the amount that you withdraw as part of your adjusted gross income. So you would be able to roll that directly without having the tax implications of those funds. And that's something that can make an immediate impact. So if it's something that you're not doing, or you're interested in learning about how to take money from your IRA and put it into some of these charitable distributions, something that can be easily facilitated. The other part about IRAs, which I'll just name here quickly, that you can do, and this is something to revisit, and we'll talk about it in a minute as we think about estate plans, how you get things in order, how you get your estate in order. And sometimes people, in some of the end of life kind of curriculum and training we do, we encourage people to think about every year revisiting, making sure beneficiaries are updated, making sure wills are updated, making sure everything is in the place that it should be. And gifting IRAs to charity can be really useful. So if you don't know about that, and some of the implications of taxes on some of those things, again, something to talk about. The last thing here is the tax-free distribution. Up to $50,000 can go from an IRA to a charitable gift annuity. And we talked about that the last time. The gift annuity gets put into, from this IRA, from another kind of security, gifts of stock, other things, into an account that will pay you fixed lifetime payments, and then at your death would go to a charity of your choice. So at end of year, this isn't probably something that's going to be, I also added some percentages here because they're just really nice to look at, and it's and it's really helpful to see the amount right now from charitable gift annuities. But at year end, a charitable gift annuity is not going to be something that is going to make immediate impact for the organization that you care about, but it is something that is going to be able to impact them in the future. And most organizations are very happy to hear from you that you have a charitable gift annuity, and that upon your passing that it would be going to them. So that's another tool that can be utilized, and something that you can set up. While it might not make an impact now, it's something that you could set up at this time. As I talked about earlier, just updating your estate plan, making sure that things are in order, can be really helpful, especially if you haven't looked at this kind of thing for a long time. And considering how much you might gift to children, when it might be too early or late to gift to children, or other heirs, and what the best way to gift to a charity is, are all things that can be really useful in talking with a financial consultant or professional who deals with charitable giving. And I think even to talk with your children about, which we'll get to here is the last slide. I think most of these things, especially at this year end, with the gatherings as we've named, with Thanksgiving, with Christmas, usually brings families together, or can bring families together. And there could be opportunities for these kinds of meaningful conversations, times for you to have interaction to those who are closest to you. And so how do you take advantage of these kinds of opportunities to talk about your values, about your goals, about your giving? I have experienced some really positive results. Like I said, we teach the end of life kind of curriculum and invite people to talk with their children and grandchildren about what they're doing with their money and where they're giving and why they give to particular causes and organizations. And at the beginning, it can sound intimidating or uncomfortable to kind of begin these kinds of conversations. And it's hard to talk about what happens even at your death, because people often don't want to talk about that. But what I've also found people say is thank you. These conversations have even deepened our relationships with one another. And it's been really helpful to have these conversations at this time. So going back to this slide, as we consider opportunities at year end, when we're bombarded by letters and campaign drives and people wanting to engage with us as we think about participating with their organization, may we remember the true spirit of our giving. That what we have isn't our own, that all we have has been entrusted to us by God. That God invites us to participate in what God is doing in the world and to care for those in need. That generosity is truly an act of worship. It comes out of prayer and a relationship with God, and is part of the community of faith. So we're being invited to this life transforming practice, generosity, a life transforming practice. So at year end, when everything's busy, how might you take some space to reflect, to stop, to consider all of the very good organizations? There are so many organizations that are worthy of your support. They're doing incredible work in this world. So, how will you consider what the Spirit is prompting you to do? How the Spirit is prompting you to participate? And I invite you to be generous. Mitch, I don't know if you have anything else to say. As Menno Media, who's invited people to this space, I think in our conversations as we've talked together, it's very evident that you as a development professional want people to give to the things that they care most deeply about. And you also recognize there's lots of places that people can give and participate. And I don't think that you're saying only give to Menno Media. You're saying think about the ways that you can be generous and participate. Connecting your values, being specific, having impact in particular areas. All of us are different and all of us have different sets of interests. So what are the things that we're going to engage in? Anyway, I'll leave it to you. And if there are questions, comments, conversation, let's talk.
Thank you, Lana. I'm grateful for your prompts leading us through this time. Extend my thanks to those that joined for these sessions or have watched the recordings. As Lana mentioned, Menno Media is grateful for your financial support. We can't do the work that we do in Christian formation without the support of donors, and thank you for your support in that regard. But I love celebrating the generosity of our people and recognize that there is so many different ways to make an impact in this world, and grateful for your involvement with Menno Media, but also celebrate the generosity that you spread to all of these other places. So thank you all very much. Again, I will recommend that if you don't have professionals in your life that you're having these conversations with, consider getting in touch with your local Everence advisor, or if you're in Canada, your local Abundance Canada advisor to help start these conversations. But I'm grateful for this time that we have gotten to spend together.